Hey guys, it's Mr. Young. We're going to be going through the assembly of lab number 7, capacitance. First thing I want you to do is open up the Mr. Circuit Lab manual. You will find on page 20 of the manual, we have lab 7, capacitance. On the second page of that, page 21, you're going to notice the assembly image, the picture of what it'll look like once assembled in TinkerCAD. I want you to identify some of the parts that we're going to be using here for lab 7 assembly. In the parts list, it has them listed: L1, which is a red LED, C1, which is a 1000 UF electrolytic capacitor, R1, which is a 100 ohm resistor, R2, which is a 1000 ohm resistor, SW1, which is a push button switch, your battery, a jump wire, and your breadboard. Let's go into TinkerCAD now and identify those items, bring them in, and begin assembling the circuit. First, remember, once you're in TinkerCAD, you need to select the circuit button on the left, then create new circuit. As the menu opens, you can start bringing in your components. I always like to start with the breadboard first. No need to name or change any of the values on the breadboard. Second thing I'm going to do is go right down my parts list. So I'm going to be bringing in my LED. Red LED is fine. You can change the color if you want, but since it's red in our Mr. Circuit Lab manual, we're going to make it red here. After that, in the manual, it says to bring in the electrolytic capacitor. This is the new one for us. So I want you to type in capacitor. You'll see that I've already selected it once before, but if you continue typing in the word capacitor, you'll notice that there is a blue disc capacitor and a black polarized capacitor. We want to select the polarized capacitor. And I'm going to put that down here in the lower left corner of my board. You'll see why in a little bit. When I drop this, I have to change the value of the capacitor. In the Mr. Circuit Lab manual, it said we are using a 1000 UF electrolytic capacitor. So where you see the word capacitance, change that value from 1 to 1000. We're also going to change the voltage rating right below that from 16 to 9. Now that I have my capacitor in place, I'm going to keep going down my parts list. My two resistors, the 100 and the 1000 ohm resistor, will be next. So I'm going to select the resistors from my search bar, bring in a resistor, make sure that I have the value correct. Right now it's a 1000 and I want that to be a 100 ohm since that's my R1. Then I'm going to bring in a second resistor, and this one I'm actually going to leave default because it's default to 1000 ohms. It's also named number 2, which is going to be appropriate for us since it is our R2. After the resistors, I'm going to bring in my push button switch and my battery. So now I'm going to select in the search bar the push button. You'll see that I've already had it selected once before, so it comes up right away. Place my push button switch in the center of my screen. And then lastly, I want to find my 9-volt battery. Search for battery. You'll see that 9-volt is one of the options. I'm going to place this on the left side of my board, and I'm going to rotate it. This is going to allow us to hook the terminals up easily to our breadboard. So now back in the Mr. Circuit Lab manual, looking at where these things are assembled, I have to pay close attention to what's polarized and what's not. Remember, if it's polarized, it has a positive and negative terminal, like a battery, a capacitor, and an LED. So in the Mr. Circuit Lab manual, it's going to show you here plus signs and minus signs for your polarity. Go back up to the lab here. So a battery snap is going to have a red and a black wire. That's a positive and a negative. Capacitor is going to have a positive and a negative. And then your LED is going to have a negative lead, which is identified by the short leg and the flat side of the plastic. And it's going to have a positive lead, which is the other side. So let's do this. Let's bring in a battery placement first. In the Mr. Circuit Lab manual, it says your red lead for your battery goes in the upper section of the breadboard, 1, 2, 3, 4 rows up in the first column. So I want to make sure that I begin by placing the red lead 4 rows up in the first column. I can change that wire to red, and it just helps me identify that I've placed the positive lead. In the Mr. Circuit manual, it says now go with the black lead or your negative side of the battery. That's going to be in the lower section of your breadboard, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 columns over and second row up. So I have to draw that line, second row up, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 columns over, and I'm going to change that wire to black. The next thing I'm going to do is bring in my resistor R1. So that's going to connect with the positive lead of my battery snap, and then it's going to move over 7 rows. So as I grab my R1, I can rotate it slightly just to make it easier to connect the terminals. I'm going to place the first terminal in line with the battery snap and the second terminal in the 7th column. Then I'll go in and place my jump wire. This is one that oftentimes people forget, especially when physically assembling labs. So we want to make sure that we get that in now and we don't forget about it later. So I'm going to place just a random jump wire from the upper left-hand corner of our lower section of the breadboard into the same column as the second terminal of our first resistor. So I draw this connection from here to here. Then I'm going to be placing the LED. Now let's put the capacitor in next. I'll place my capacitor with the positive terminal in the first column, 3rd row, and the negative terminal in the 7th column, 4th row. This capacitor I'm going to rotate around just to make sure that I can access the terminals easily. And I'm going to have to identify what's the positive terminal and what's the negative terminal. You'll see that the positive terminal comes up with the word positive, and the negative terminal comes up with the word negative. Let's connect the positive terminal into row 3, column 1, change that wire color to red. Let's connect the negative terminal into row 4, column 7. And we're going to change that wire color to black. So now I have my polarized capacitor in place, first resistor, battery, and jump wire. What else do we have to put in here? Let's put our resistor 2 in. This is going to help us align the LED afterwards. So resistor 2 is going to go in the same row as the negative lead of our capacitor and the negative lead of our battery. Then it's going to jump over 6 rows and just kind of get placed on its own. So I'm going to bring my resistor R2 down below my board, rotate it slightly. Start by placing the first terminal connection in line with our battery and our negative capacitor, and the second terminal connection 7 rows over to the right. Now I'm going to put my LED in place. The cathode leg of the LED is going to go in the same row as the resistor. The unique thing about the LED in TinkerCad is that the 2 legs of the LED are separated perfectly spaced apart to fit in the board. So I'm just going to drag this down here and place it right on the board. You'll see it makes the 2 terminal connections perfectly in the board. So I don't need to add a jump wire or move a wire to get this to line up. It's perfect the way it is. The next thing I'm going to do is place the switch. The switch is going to go in line with the positive leg of the LED. And then it's going to go in the top row with the second terminal of R1. So I place this in the same row as terminal 2 for R1 and the same row as the jump wire. Looking at this circuit now, I can tell that it is completely assembled based on the Mr. Circuit Lab manual. The last thing I have to do here is test it. In order to get credit for this lab, you're going to have to start the simulation, then press the switch with the mouse. You have to click right on the switch. You should see the LED lights up. The capacitor is going to allow us to keep energy in this circuit going even when I stop pressing the button, but it's only a brief period of time. There isn't going to be much of a way for me to tell whether or not your capacitor is correct, other than the fact that when you let go, you'll see it dim out very quickly. In order to get credit for this, I want you to depress the push button to illuminate the LED. From here, you're going to take your screenshot while the button is depressed. Paste that into your Lab 7 in the Google Classroom, answer the questions that go along with the lab, and you should be done with Lab 7.